Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today, we are going to be going through the discography of George Harrison. Everybody seems to have a different Beatle that is their favorite, and for me, when it comes to the group The Beatles, I've always had a hard time picking a favorite in terms of their musical contributions, but when it comes to each member on their own post-Beatles and their solo discographies, I do think that George Harrison's solo work does stand out the most, and he would definitely be my favorite solo artist of the Beatles. I do love all four members, and they have a lot of great solo stuff, but I do think that George contributed some of the strongest albums and some of the best individual songs of the entire solo Beatles catalog. So I'm very happy to be covering him for today's episode, and what I'm going to do is go through his 12 studio albums, starting with Wonderwall Music and going up to Brainwashed, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 12 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have his debut studio album from 1968 titled Wonderwall Music, which is a soundtrack to the film Wonderwall, and I will give this one a B. I actually do enjoy this album. Some people might be surprised by this score, but honestly, I feel like this album is better than a lot of people give it credit for. The music on here is almost all instrumental, and stylistically, a good chunk of it is in that Indian music realm that George had started exploring and writing around in 1960. And for people who really resonate with that side of George's style and songwriting, I think this is a very enjoyable album for those types of listeners. And I do like most of this record. It's definitely pretty psychedelic and vibey, and because of how different it is from George's pop and rock side, it is one of those albums that I do need to be in a particular mood to listen to, but if I am in the right mood for it, this is a very enjoyable listen. In addition to the Indian music, there's also a nice blend of some instrumental rock songs that are very nice and provide nice little changes in mood from time to time. For the Indian songs, my favorites would be Greasy Legs, Love Scene, In the Park, and Dream Scene, which kind of veers off halfway through into some experimental territories. My personal favorites of the rock instrumentals would be Red Lady 2, Drilling a Home, Cowboy Music, and Wonderwall to Be Here. So in general, I do have positive feelings about this album. My main reasoning for putting it in B tier is, like I said, the fact that it is an album that I do need to be in a very particular mood to listen to. I don't find myself going back and revisiting this one as much as a lot of his other albums. And although I do enjoy most of this album, I wouldn't say that any of the songs on here would go down as any of my favorite George Harrison tracks. So those would really be my only two critiques. But this is an album that gives us a really nice wide selection of George Harrison's Indian influences, combined with some instrumental rock tracks here and there, and I think it definitely delivers some really great moments, and for me this would certainly not be his worst album. So a pretty good debut album, obviously very different from a lot of the stuff that would follow it, but still very enjoyable nonetheless, so this will get a B. Okay, next we have his second studio album from 1969 titled Electronic Sound. And I'm going to give this one a D, unfortunately. I've always had a really hard time with this album, and this one goes down as my least favorite George Harrison record. This is an experimental record which has two long pieces that are centered around the Moog synthesizer, which had been invented in the mid-60s, but hadn't really been utilized very much by rock musicians up to this point. And this was actually one of the first electronic albums to be made by a rock musician. So in terms of experimentation and musical exploration with new technology, I have great respect for the fact that George Harrison had decided to branch out even more and explore these new sounds. But as an album, I do find both of the songs on here to be a pretty tough listen. The way the synthesizer was used throughout these two songs was very much in an exploration of sound sort of manner. There's really no melodies to grasp onto, and really nothing that has any semblance to a song form. It's just a lot of noises that are sometimes very cool, but don't translate into a very enjoyable and listenable album, in my opinion. But like I said, I do respect the fact that he was one of the first rock musicians to make an album like this, and I'm sure it did contribute to a lot of other rock artists wanting to delve into the world of synthesizers and electronic music. So that would be the main thing that I would say I appreciate about the album, but from a music and sound perspective, I do think that this is a pretty tough listen. So this one goes down as my least favorite George Harrison album, unfortunately. This one gets a D. Alright, next we have his third studio album from 1970 titled All Things Must Pass. And no surprises here, this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, and this goes down as my number one favorite George Harrison album, and probably the best triple album of all time as well. I don't know of very many triple albums, but I doubt that anything could give this one a run for its money. And I know it's a super cliche choice as a favorite album, but when you go through these tracks, I think it's pretty hard to argue that this isn't his most exceptional release. Even though he had released the two albums prior to this was the first album to be released after the breakup of the Beatles, and to me this album is just a creative explosion on George's part. The album consists of 4 sides of new originals, and then there are 2 additional sides titled Apple Jam, which consist of instrumental jams, some of which were recorded during the album sessions. And the songs going from side 1 to side 4 contain a variety of different tracks written over the years, some written a few years prior, some written more recently, and some that were offered to the Beatles and had been turned down. And a lot of the subject matter covered throughout this album is about George Harrison's spiritual seekings, as well as reflections on the ending of the Beatles. And it's great to hear what he is fully capable of when he isn't tied down by any other creative forces and strapped down creatively like he had been in the Beatles. And I think this album is the perfect response to really show them how good he is at writing songs. We have Phil Spector on production, so we get that very big wall of sound with lots of reverb. And we also have a lot of big guest features ranging from Eric Clapton to Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, Bobby Keys, Peter Frampton, and many, many more. I think side 1 is about as good of an opening side to an album as you can ask for, kicking off with 4 back-to-back incredible tracks with I'd Have You Anytime, which brings the album in on a nice chill and romantic vibe. And this song is particularly special to me because it was me and my wife's first dance at our wedding. And then it goes into My Sweet Lord, which is one of the big hits from this album and obviously a George Harrison classic. And then Wah Wah gives us a nice little jolt of energy, and then Isn't It a Pity is a beautiful ballad that ends side 1 on such a pretty note and is just such a strong opening 4 tracks. It's really unbelievable. And then side 2 just keeps the momentum up with another 5 incredible tracks, starting out with What Is Life, which is another legendary hit of his. And I love all 4 of the remaining tracks on side 2. I think they all balance each other out very nicely. My other favorites would be Behind the Locked Door and Run of the Mill. For me, this is one of those albums where as I'm going through it from track to track, I'm just blown away at how many incredible songs he is hitting us with. And to be able to sustain that for 4 entire sides of music is just such an impressive thing to pull off. Side 3 has 5 more tracks. My favorites on there would be Ballad of Sir Frankie Crisp, and the closing title track, All Things Must Pass, which was one of the songs that was offered to the Beatles and they turned it down, which I think was a big loss on their part. I will say, side 3 has one song that I've never been crazy about, which is Apple Scruffs. For some reason, that song has just never resonated with me, but for an album with this many tracks to only have one song that I dislike, I think is a pretty amazing thing to pull off. Then we have side 4, which gives us 4 more tracks, one of them being an alternate version of Isn't It a Pity? My favorite on side 4 would be Art of Dying. I love the drive and heaviness of that track. And when it comes to side 5 and 6 with the Apple Jam tracks, I do enjoy these, but I don't typically go back and listen to these tracks as much as I do with the first 4 sides of the album. For me personally, I consider the first 4 sides to really be the main part of the album, and then the Apple Jam is kind of like a little bonus at the end if I'm in the mood to change gears and listen to them jam out to some instrumental grooves. But yeah, just such an incredible album. Of all of the George Harrison albums, this is the one that contains the largest amount of my favorite George Harrison songs. And like I said, from side 1 to 4, I think it is just so consistent with so many exceptional tracks and only has that one song that I'm not crazy about. So 17 songs that I all consider to be great with a nice variety in style and mood, and also Phil Spector doing a great job on production, which adds a whole nother additional layer to the sound. I just cannot say enough good things about this album. An incredible first post-Beatles album for George to release. I don't think he could have done a better job, and this is my number 1 favorite George Harrison album. So no surprises here, this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have his 4th studio album from 1973 titled Living in the Material World, and this is another one that gets an easy S. Absolutely love this album. All Things Must Pass is an incredibly hard album to follow, and I think he did about as good of a job as he could have done with this one. And this is actually my second favorite George Harrison album, so he has been on a roll with these past two records. This one has 11 songs, and lyrically, I really love what he's writing about throughout this. The lyrics are just super honest, and he's commenting a lot on his quest for spiritual enlightenment and how being famous can sometimes complicate that. And there are many facets to George Harrison as a person, but I think when it comes to his spiritual side and his hope for spreading love and peace on earth, I think this album is the best representation of that part of him as a human. We get a lot of that on All Things Must Pass as well, but it was also mixed in with some other subject matters, and I think this album is a little more straightforward with the messaging that it's giving off. Side 1 has 6 tracks and side 2 has 5, and I would say the general mood of this album is more mellow and peaceful, but then there are a couple of more rocking tracks scattered throughout, like Sue Me, Sue You Blues, the title track Living in the Material World, and The Lord Loves the One. My 3 favorites from side 1 would be Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, The Light That Has Lighted the World, and Who Can See It? Who Can See It is easily my favorite track from side 1. I absolutely love the chord progression and the very tasteful and colorful vocal melody. A perfect George Harrison song in my opinion. For side 2, I love every track other than the opener, The Lord Loves the One. That's the one song on here that I've never resonated with very much for whatever reason, but my number one favorite track from this album would Be Here Now, which is not only my favorite song on this album, but would also probably make my top 5 favorite George Harrison songs. Just an absolutely beautiful song about mindfulness and spirituality. I also love The Day the World Gets Round. Really great guitar work on that one, and just a very pretty and feel-good song. So yeah, I just have very good thoughts about this album. Similar to All Things Must Pass, this one also contains a good chunk of songs that would make my list of favorite George Harrison songs, and I think he did about as good of a job as he could have with following up the very tough to follow album All Things Must Pass. The songs are incredibly strong on here and contain some of his best songs of his entire discography. So another amazing album, my second favorite George Harrison album. This one gets an easy S. Alright, moving on, we have his 5th studio album from 1974 titled Dark Horse. And unfortunately, I'm going to give this one a C. I've always had a hard time with this one. I know some people enjoy it, but I've never been able to get into it no matter how many times I listen to it. I do think it is a big downgrade from the 2 albums that preceded it, and I think there are a lot of different reasons for that. It was a weird time in his life at this point. He had gone through a divorce with Patty Boyd, which would be the subject matter of some of the songs on here, and he was also spending a lot of time setting up his Dark Horse record label, which made the songwriting and the music kind of go onto the back burner, and I think it resulted in a largely underwhelming album that does have a couple of good tracks here and there, but I do find the majority of the songs on here to be pretty flat and uninteresting. For side 1, really the only track I enjoy is So Sad. I do think that is a really solid song, and I think side 2 is a little bit stronger than side 1. It's got 2 tracks that I really enjoy with Ding Dong Ding Dong and Far East Man. But other than those 3 tracks, I do find the rest of this album to be kind of underwhelming, and when you compare it to All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World, I think that really illustrates how much of a downgrade this album was from those other 2. I do think the album cover is really cool though, probably my favorite album cover of any George Harrison record, so that's one more positive thing I will say in its favor. But yeah, other than those 3 tracks, I'm really not crazy about this album, and it would definitely be lower on my list of how I rank George Harrison's albums. So not a great album in my opinion, unfortunately. This one gets a C. Okay, next we have his 6th studio album from 1975 titled Extra Texture, Read All About It, and I will give this a B. I think this album is okay, but not great. I would say it's a slight improvement from Dark Horse, but still has its share of skip-over tracks. In terms of subject matter, this album is largely devoid of the spiritual stuff that we saw on the previous few albums, and instead features a couple of songs written during the lead-up to his divorce with Patty Boyd, a couple of songs that are tributes to other people, and a few songs based on events and things from Harrison's life. We have 10 songs with 5 on each side, and I do think that side 1 is pretty good and is a little bit stronger than side 2. The opening track, which is titled You, I think is the high point of this album and starts things out on a really great note. I love the guitar riff for that one. For the remainder of side 1, I also do enjoy the answers at the end. This guitar can't keep from crying, and Ooh Baby, You Know That I Love You. For side 2, the main high point for me is Can't Stop Thinking About You, which I think is a very beautiful song and would be my second favorite track on here. But other than that, I find side 2 largely underwhelming, and I do think this album can feel kind of laggy at times. There's a lot of tracks on the slower side, which isn't always a bad thing, but because some of the songs are sort of like skip-overs, it does make this album feel like it drags a little bit. But it still has 5 songs that I think are solid, and I wouldn't regard any of them as my favorite George Harrison tracks, but I still wouldn't say it's a terrible album, and it is a slight improvement from Dark Horse, but not anything special. So I would say this is an okay album. I will give it a B. Okay, next we have his 7th studio album from 1976 titled 33 1/3, and I will give this one an S. A very good album, and in my opinion, this is his best record since Living in the Material World. This is the first album that he would release under his Dark Horse record label, and during the making of this album, there was definitely some stressful stuff going on in his life. He had been battling a plagiarism suit for My Sweet Lord, and he also got hepatitis in the early stages of making this album. So not ideal circumstances, but even in the midst of all of those challenges, I think that he knocked it out of the park with this one. This album has 10 tracks with 5 on each side, and I think the overwhelming majority of songs on here are amazing and are his most high quality songs since Living in the Material World. I love the way side 1 opens up with Woman Don't You Cry For Me. Definitely slightly unexpected, hitting you with this groovy slap bass riff right off the bat, but I love it, and I think it's a super groovy and just cool song to bring things in. I really love the 2 songs that follow that as well, with Dear One and Beautiful Girl. To me, these songs have similar vibes to stuff that was on All Things Must Pass and Living in the Material World, which is great to hear at this point in his discography, and I think doing a little bit of a return to that stylistically was a very effective move. I love the way side 2 opens up with It's What You Value, another very cool and groovy song that brings side 2 in so nicely. The Cole Porter cover of True Love is also very nice and has that George Harrison flavor put onto it, which I think makes for a very nice interpretation of this song. Pure Smokey would be the one song on side 2 that I'm not super crazy about, but I do enjoy Cracker Box Palace. I think that song is really fun and feel good, and Learning How to Love is one of my favorite closing tracks of any George Harrison album. I absolutely love the vibe of this song. It's very chill, but also slightly mysterious and has some really interesting chord movements as well. At one point, he's using a 13 flat 9 chord, which is a very jazzy type of harmony, and that particular chord always catches my ear. And I think ending the album with this ballad is a really nice contrast to how it opens up with that really groovy slap bass centered track. So I really think he knocked it out of the park with this album. Like I said, I think it's his best album and his best songs since Living in the Material World, and definitely has a couple of tracks in here that would also be regarded as some of my favorite George Harrison songs. So an amazing album. This one gets an S. Alright, next we have his 8th studio album from 1979, which is a self-titled album titled George Harrison, and I will also give this one an S. Another amazing album, and this one is my 4th favorite George Harrison album. I think it's an even further improvement upon 33 1/3. Stylistically, it's in that pop rock, soft rock sort of realm, and it was written and recorded during a better period of George's life where he had gotten remarried, and he also became a father to his son Danny, and I think he wrote some of his best songs of the later 70s on this album. The album has 10 tracks with 5 on each side. Side 1 opens incredibly strong with Love Comes to Everyone, definitely one of my favorite opening tracks of any George Harrison album. And the 2 other songs on side 1 that I think are particularly exceptional are Here Comes the Moon and Blow Away. And really the only song on this album that I'm not crazy for is track 2, titled Not Guilty. But other than that, I think all of side 1 is great. I think all of side 2 is very strong. My 2 favorites from side 2 would be Dark Sweet Lady and Your Love Is Forever. Your Love Is Forever is hands down my favorite song on this album, just an absolutely beautiful love song, and this would also definitely make my list of top 10, maybe even top 5 favorite George Harrison tracks. In my opinion, this is probably the most beautiful song that he's written since living in the material world, and I also really love the vibe of Dark Sweet Lady with the acoustic guitars and the jazzy chord movements with the percussion. That song has always given me imagery of like being on a beach late at night, just a super relaxing and nice song. So all in all, I think this album is very strong, and like I said, it does contain a handful of tracks that are some of the best songs that he's written from the mid to late 70s, with songs like Love Comes to Everyone, Here Comes the Moon, Blow Away, and Your Love Is Forever. So some really standout tracks on here, an even further improvement upon 33 1/3 in my opinion. My fourth favorite George Harrison album, this one gets an S. Okay, next we have his 9th studio album from 1981 titled Somewhere in England, and I will give this a B. I think this album is okay. There are some things that I like about it, but also some things that I find kind of underwhelming. With the previous album being recorded during a stable and good time in Harrison's life, this one was a little bit different, and there had been some conflicts with his record label, and George was becoming more and more frustrated with the music industry, and I think it resulted in a largely subpar album. This one has 10 tracks with 5 on each side, and I enjoy about half of this album, very similar to how I feel with Extra Texture. There are a couple of things that I actually do really enjoy on here. I think Blood from a Clone is a very cool opening song, and when it comes in and you hear the production and the synth sounds, it's pretty clear that we have entered into the 80s period of George Harrison. Which I'm not super crazy about from a production standpoint, but I do think that this song has some cool grooves to it, and just from a music theory perspective, the little short instrumental part with the guitar figure over it that happens after the second chorus is incredibly intricate from a rhythmic and time perspective. That was one thing that always really caught my ear about this song, and something that I find very interesting when you hear that change in the drum groove and it kind of disorients you. A really cool moment. I also really love track 3 titled Life Itself. That would be by far my favorite song on this album, and one of the most spiritual songs that he has released since Dark Horse, and I think anytime George is writing in that realm, he always delivers very high quality stuff. I also enjoy track 4, All Those Years Ago, which is a tribute to John Lennon, who had gotten murdered prior to the release of this album. I do think side 1 is stronger than side 2, and to me, side 2 does take a big dip in momentum. It does have 2 songs that I think are pretty good, with Writings on the Wall and the closing track, Save the World. I would say that Save the World would be the strongest song from side 2, but of all of the tracks that I do enjoy on here, I wouldn't say that any of them are really exceptional George Harrison tracks. Other than Life Itself, I do think that song is very strong and really beautiful, with a very peaceful and serene melody to it that's also very catchy. But I would say that about half of this album is largely uninteresting and definitely has some skip over tracks, so I wouldn't say it's a great release, but it does have a handful of songs that I do think balance it out and redeem it somewhat. So definitely not one of his best albums, but also not one of his worst either, so I will give this one a B. Okay, next we have his 10th studio album from 1982 titled Gone Troppo, and this is probably going to surprise some people, but I'm going to give this one a B. I know a lot of people regard this as his worst album, but I definitely don't dislike it as much as a lot of other people do. I know that when it came out, it didn't get good reviews, but in all honesty, I do enjoy a chunk of this album, and I do think it is probably, I don't know if I would say better than Somewhere in England, but I would say it's kind of in the same territory. It's got 10 songs on here, and there's only really like 3 songs that I dislike. The remaining 7 I think are okay. I don't really have too much of a problem with them. I think side 1, most of it I think is solid. I think Wake Up My Love is a nice energetic opener. I love the synth sounds. That's the Way It Goes is a pretty mid-tempo track that contrasts the opener nicely. I Really Love You is kind of cheesy, and that's one of the songs on here I could do without. But I think Grease is actually a pretty solid track, probably my favorite from side 1. In particular, the instrumental sections I think are really beautiful and have that classic sweet and melodic George Harrison touch. And then the title track, I think, is also a very pretty and catchy song that wraps up side 1 very nicely. Side 2 has 5 songs, and I like 3 of the 5 songs from side 2. The 2 that I'm not crazy about are Mystical One and Dream Away, but I do enjoy Unknown Delight, Baby Don't Run Away, and Circles. Unknown Delight would hands down be my favorite track on this album. To me, this song has always sounded like a song that could have been on Living in the Material World. Just a really beautiful song, and for me, the high point of this album. So it does have a couple of tracks that I'm not crazy about, but I think that, the remaining 7 are pretty solid, and I am kind of surprised at the amount of negativity that this album does get, because I do think it is a little bit better than some people give it credit for, but I could also understand why some people might not resonate as much with kind of just in general the early 80s sound of George Harrison. So, in my opinion, an okay album. I will give this one a B. All right, next we have his 11th studio album from 1987 titled Cloud 9, and this one gets an easy S. Incredible album. This one goes down as my third favorite George Harrison album, and such a significant improvement from everything else that he put out in the 80s. And this would be the last record that he would put out in his lifetime after a 5-year hiatus from his solo career, and I don't think he could have gone out on a higher note, especially in comparison to Somewhere in England and Gone Troppo. We have Jeff Lynne contributing production on here, and you can definitely hear the Jeff Lynne flavors all throughout this album, and I think George and Jeff are a magical pairing together. We also have the return of some great guests like Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, and Elton John. Stylistically, these songs are very much in a pop rock sort of realm, but I think almost every song on here is very high quality and catchy, and still contains some surprising moments here and there that do make for an adventurous listen. There are a couple of moments in songs throughout this album that I could do without, but I do think the overwhelming majority of stuff on here is awesome. Side 1, I think, is perfect from track 1 to 6. Not one song that I dislike, and I love the pacing and mood shift from track to track. Cloud 9 opens us up with a nice groovy mid-tempo track. That's What It Takes and Fish on the Sand give us some nice pop and rock flavors. Just for Today gives us a nice ballad for the middle point of the album with a beautiful progression in the piano. This Is Love gives us a nice jolt of energy with a beautiful poppy track with a great chorus. And then When We Was Fab is the perfect closer to side 1. I love the vibe of this track, and the chord progression is very colorful and has some unorthodox turns that really catch my ear. My 2 favorite songs on side 1 would also be the last 2 tracks, This Is Love and When We Was Fab. Side 2 gives us 5 more solid tracks. I do think side 2 is a little bit less good than side 1, but still very solid. Devil's Radio opens up side 2 on a groovy and poppy vibe. Someplace Else is a classic, just pretty George Harrison ballad. Definitely my favorite song from side 2. Wreck of the Hesperus is a cool grooving track, another one with some interesting chord movements. I love the way George Harrison uses diminished 7th chords. To me, when it comes to rock artists, he is one of the best when it comes to utilizing diminished chords in an interesting and tasteful way. Breathe Away from Heaven has a super cool vibe to it. I love the sounds of the keyboards. Definitely gives us a bit of that Eastern flavor, which is nice to hear on this album. And then Got My Mind Set on You is a classic George Harrison track, which is actually a cover, which I didn't know until I did some research for this video. And I've heard some people say that this is one of those songs that has an amazing chorus followed by the most underwhelming verse, and I definitely agree with that, and this would be an example of like one of those moments on this album that I'm not crazy about, but the chorus is so strong that it basically carries the whole song for me. But yeah, just one amazing song after the next. I really have very little bad things to say about this record. And there is also a couple of songs on here that would make my favorite George Harrison song list. So an amazing last album for him to release in his lifetime. And in my opinion, this album completely redeemed him from the prior couple of underwhelming albums. So a really great release. My third favorite George Harrison album. This one gets an S. All right, and last but not least, we have his 12th and final studio album, which was a posthumous album released in 2002, almost a year after his death, titled Brainwashed, and I will give this one an A. I think this is a really solid and consistent album. Prior to the release of this, he had not made an album in 15 years, and this record is comprised of tracks that he had written throughout the years, starting as early as 1988, and George had been working on this album with his his son Danny and Jeff Lynne, but unfortunately he was battling throat cancer during this time and he lost the battle to it before the project was finished, but he left a guide for completing it to Jeff Lynne and his son Danny. And I think because of the fact that he was very active in the process of making this album, it doesn't feel like one of those posthumous albums where you are not sure if it is coming out the way the artist had intended it to, because that is so often the case with posthumous albums for me. But this one feels very authentic and it feels like it came out the way that George had intended it to. It's got 12 tracks and I think the songwriting is very good throughout. The production is great, and from front to back I think it's a solid and consistent album. It does have a track or two on here that I'm not crazy about, but I would say about 85% of this album is great. I think the opening track, Any Road, is probably the strongest song on here, and some other standouts for me are Pisces Fish, Rising Sun, Stuck Inside a Cloud, Never Get Over You, and the title track, Brainwashed. So I think this was a great final album for him to go out on, and the fact that he was in the process of making this at the time of his death is pretty crazy timing, given the fact that he hadn't released an album in 15 years. So I'm very grateful that we were able to get one final album from him, and I think in the grand scheme of his discography, this is definitely one of his better albums, and I think he went out on a very strong note with the help of Jeff Lynne and his son. And I think it also makes it extra special that his son was able to contribute on this album as well, because that is something that we had never experienced before, and I think just adding that onto this final album made it even that much more meaningful. So a very good final album. This one gets an A. All right, we did it. We went through his 12 studio albums, and this is what I came up with. Really so many gems throughout the course of this discography. Not every single album is a home run, of course, but I do think that when it comes to solo Beatles discographies, I tend to resonate the most with George Harrison's solo works, and I think all of the albums in S tier are incredibly strong, and even the albums that were a little bit lower still contain some very high quality individual tracks, and George Harrison has just always had an authenticity and honesty about him in his writing that I think is a very special trait that we don't always get from other artists, and one of the reasons why I think his solo work really stood out, because we got a little glimpse of him throughout the Beatles albums, but getting to really hear him fully express himself throughout this 12 album discography is really a great thing to witness. So I'm glad to have finally covered him for today's episode. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and I hope you learned a thing or two. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out my other tier lists, which will be linked in the description and the comments, and see if there is anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 12 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. All right, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.